Hello and welcome back to RPG PhD. I'm Dr. Ben. Everybody knows the feeling. You've got a great idea. You know what your character wants to do. You're engaged, ready, leaning forward. And then you wait. Someone else takes a long turn. Then another person asks 3 rules questions. Then the game master pauses to look something up. Then a side conversation starts. By the time it gets back to you, the energy is gone. We usually talk about this as a pacing issue or maybe a table management issue, but there is actually a whole field of mathematics and operations research built around studying exactly this kind of problem. Queuing theory. Queuing theory is normally used to analyze waiting lines. Some interesting things appear when you start looking at tabletop role-playing games through that lens. Turn order is a queue. Spotlight is a queue. Players waiting for the game master's attention is a queue. Even downtime between meaningful decisions is a kind of queue. So in this video, I want to explore what queuing theory is, how it helps us think differently about tabletop role-playing games, and what game masters and designers can do to reduce bad waiting while preserving tension, drama, and structure. Queuing theory is the study of systems in which some demand arrives, waits if necessary, and is then processed by some service mechanism. In the standard literature, the core elements usually include an arrival process, a queue or waiting line, and one or more servers that provide service. A great deal of the field is concerned with questions like these. How long does an item wait? How many items are likely to be in line? What happens when arrivals come in faster than the system can handle them? How does performance change when service speeds up or slows down? One of the most useful ideas here is that waiting comes from more than just having a line. Waiting emerges from the relationship between how often things arrive and how quickly they can be handled. If arrivals are light and service is quick, the system flows smoothly. If arrivals are frequent and service takes longer, the queue grows, and once utilization gets high, delays can increase sharply. That's one of the reasons queuing theory matters so much in operations research, engineering, and computer systems. It gives people a way to think systematically about congestion, delay, and bottlenecks. Applied to tabletop role-playing games, the analogy is surprisingly productive. At the table, the thing being served is not coffee or technical support, it is meaningful participation. A player wants to declare an action, ask a question, contribute to a plan, speak in character, respond to danger, or push the fiction somewhere new. Then that contribution has to be received, interpreted, and resolved by the table, often through the game master and through the rules. So the value of queuing theory here is that it gives us a vocabulary for something players feel immediately. Access delayed over time. Because we have language for that, we can start asking better questions about pacing, turn structure, spotlight, and downtime. At the table, players are constantly generating requests for participation. They want to take actions, ask questions, speak in character, search an area, negotiate with an NPC, respond to danger, contribute to a plan, or trigger a mechanic. Those are the arrivals in a loose applied sense. Then something has to process them. Sometimes that is the initiative system. Sometimes it's the game master. Sometimes it's a rule procedure. Or maybe it's the social structure of the table itself. Seen that way, a tabletop RPG is full of queues. And as I mentioned before, combat gives you the clearest example. Initiative order creates an explicit waiting line. One player acts, the system resolves that action, then the next player gets served. If turns are short and clear, the line moves quickly. If turns are long, rules heavy, or interrupted by lookups and recalculation, the queue deepens and everyone else waits longer. Outside combat, the queues become less formal but no less real. In a social scene, 3 players may all want to question the same NPC. In an investigation scene, everyone may want the game master's attention all at once to inspect clues, test theories, or declare separate actions. During travel or planning, players may sit in line for a chance to contribute while 1 or 2 people dominate the conversational flow. There may be no numbered initiative tracker on the table, but there is still a service order. It is simply less visible. And that's relevant because invisible cues often feel natural to the people who are moving through them easily. They feel much less natural to the people left waiting. This is also why a single RPG session is usually not one cue. It is several overlapping cues at the same time. There's the turn order cue, there's the spotlight cue, there's the rules resolution cue, there's the cue for the game master attention. There may even be a cue for emotional response, where a player has done something important and is waiting for the fiction to acknowledge it. With those layers in mind, a lot of familiar problems become easier to describe. A session can feel slow even when individual turns are not especially long, because several cues are stacking on top of each other. A player may wait for their initiative turn, then wait again while the game master resolves consequences, then wait again for the fiction to come back around to what their action changed. In a different kind of game, a player may get frequent chances to speak, but still feel underserved because their contributions don't alter much in the shared fiction. One of the reasons queuing theory is useful here is that waiting is more than just a mechanical fact. It's also a psychological experience. In operations and service research, the experience of waiting is shaped by more than the clock itself. David Maister's well-known discussion of waiting lines argues that uncertain waits often feel longer than known finite waits, and unexplained waits often feel longer than explained waits. He also notes that fairness is important because people are highly sensitive to whether a queue appears to be moving in an orderly and justified way. Those points are not trivial. They help explain why two waits of similar length can feel completely different. That maps onto tabletop role-playing games very well. A player can tolerate a surprising amount of delay when the structure feels clear, if they know their turn is coming soon, if they understand what is happening in the fiction, and if the scene still gives them something to pay attention to. The wait often feels manageable. A much shorter delay can feel frustrating when the player has no idea when they will get to contribute again, or when the spotlight keeps drifting in ways that feel arbitrary. This is why predictability is a concern. In queue research and waiting line psychology, uncertainty consistently increases frustration because people don't know how long the delay will last or whether the system is functioning fairly. At the table, that can mean a player is less bothered by a long initiative round than by an open-ended social scene where they cannot tell when they will be invited back in. Fairness is also relevant. Research summaries on queue psychology emphasize that unfair waits feel longer and generate stronger irritation, especially when people think others are cutting ahead or being served by unclear rules. That has an obvious parallel in tabletop play. A table may not have anyone behaving badly in any intentional sense, but if one or two players consistently get immediate response while others sit in silence, the structure starts to feel inequitable. Once that happens, disengagement can set in very quickly. There is also the question of what the player is doing while they wait. Waiting tends to feel easier when attention has something to hold on to. Service management discussions often note that occupied time is experienced differently from unoccupied time, which is part of why so many real-world waiting environments try to provide information, distraction, or visible progress. Tabletop role-playing games have their own version of that. If I am waiting for my turn in combat, but I am tracking danger, revising my plan, reacting to consequences, and staying emotionally invested in the scene, that waiting is still part of play. If I'm simply sitting there while energy drains out of the room, the same amount of clock time feels much longer. Let me give you an example. A rogue sneaking through a guarded hallway can take several minutes of table time, and the rest of the group may stay completely engaged because one mistake could bring the whole fortress down on them. A much shorter town scene can feel slower if one player talks to an NPC while everyone else sits there unsure whether they can join in or when the spotlight will come back around. The clock time may be shorter, but the waiting feels worse because it is emptier and less predictable. So one of the big lessons here is that actual wait time and experience wait time are not identical. What matters is the shape of the delay. Is it clear? Is it fair? Is the player still mentally inside the scene? Do they know when they are likely to matter again? That's a useful shift in perspective for game masters and designers because it means a pacing problem is not always about raw duration. Sometimes the issue is uncertainty. Sometimes it's inequality. And sometimes it's that the weight has become empty. Combat is probably the cleanest place to see queue structure in tabletop role-playing games because initiative systems are in effect ways of deciding who gets served next. In queuing theory, the queue discipline is the rule that determines the order of service. First come, first serve is the most familiar example, but it is not the only one. Systems can also use priority rules, random order, or other scheduling disciplines depending on the goals of the system. In other words, the order of service is not neutral. It is a design choice. That's a very useful insight for tabletop play because initiative is also a design choice about service order. It decides who acts first, who waits, how predictable the sequence is, and how long control remains with one person before it shifts to somebody else. A traditional fixed initiative order has some obvious strengths. It is clear, legible, and stable. Once the order is established, everyone usually knows where they stand in the line. That predictability can reduce uncertainty, and uncertainty is one of the things that often makes waiting feel worse. But that same stability can also create long stretches of dead air when the table is large or turns are mechanically dense. If 6 players and several enemies all act one after another in a rigid sequence, each person may spend far more time waiting than acting. With this lens, different turn systems appear to be more than just stylistic preferences and begin to look like different queue disciplines. A side-based initiative system compresses several turns into one team block, which can speed coordination and reduce some transitions. At the same time, it can also make internal spotlight distribution less even if 1 or 2 players dominate group planning. A more dynamic system like popcorn initiative or player-chosen next turns can shorten perceived waiting for some players and create a greater sense of momentum, though it may also introduce social unevenness if the same people keep getting selected early. There's also a useful connection here to work on turn-taking in conversation. Classic conversation analysis argues that turn-taking systems organize who speaks next and when, and that those systems are fundamental to coordinated social interaction. They are not random. They distribute opportunities to act. Initiative does something similar in a more formalized way. It allocates temporary authority over the next meaningful move in the shared fiction. So when we talk about turn systems like initiative, we're talking about how a game distributes weighting. How visible is the line? How often does control rotate? How long does each person sit before they can do something that matters? Those are pacing questions, but they are also queue design questions. A lot of combat fatigue comes from the structure of waiting, not just from the content of the encounter. A battle can be strategically interesting and still feel sluggish if the service order produces too much idle time between meaningful actions. On the other hand, a simpler encounter can feel lively if the turn structure keeps attention circulating quickly around the table. So one of the big takeaways here is that turn systems are not just a neutral container for action. It is part of the experience itself. When you choose a turn structure, you're also choosing a waiting structure. Outside combat, the queue is usually informal, but it is still there. In any group conversation, opportunities to speak and be taken up don't distribute themselves automatically. Classic work in conversation analysis argues that turn-taking is organized through recognizable procedures that shape who speaks next and when. The system is flexible, but is still a system. People don't simply talk in a random flow. Access to the floor is managed socially. That is highly relevant for tabletop role-playing games because most non-combat play depends on exactly that kind of informal turn-taking. In a negotiation scene, several players may want to question the same NPC. In an investigation scene, multiple people may want to inspect different details, test theories, or push the conversation in separate directions. In a planning scene, everyone may have ideas, though only a few voices may actually shape the shared decision. With this lens, you can see that freeform play often contains a hidden cue. There may be no initiative tracker, no numbered order, and no explicit your turn, my turn structure. Even so, players are still waiting for access to the fiction. They are waiting for the game master's attention, for a conversational opening, for acknowledgement for their idea to be taken seriously, or for the scene to swing back toward their character. Research on small group discussions supports the idea that participation is often unequal. Studies of talk distribution in groups note that larger groups tend to show more inequality in participation than smaller groups. And related work tracks participation imbalance by measuring who gets more turns, more influence, or more centrality in the discussion. That does not mean every conversation is unfair, but it does mean that unequal access to the floor is a normal risk in group settings. That should sound familiar to anyone who has run or played in a tabletop RPG. Some players are quick to jump in. Some process internally before they speak. Some are socially assertive. Some wait for a clear invitation. Some characters are easy for the game master to service because their goals fit the scene immediately. Others may have great ideas but fewer natural openings. All of that affects the spotlight cue even in a table full of thoughtful people. Here's an example. At the table, the party is negotiating with a city magistrate to secure access to a sealed district. The bard's player is very quick socially and jumps in first with a polished argument. The rogue's player follows immediately, adding clever details and pressing the magistrate on a legal loophole. The wizard's player chimes in with a few sharp observations about the district's history. Meanwhile, the cleric's player has an idea about appealing to the magistrate's religious duty, and the fighter's player wants to mention their military background as proof the group can handle the danger. But neither finds a clean opening before the conversation has already moved on. The game master is responding naturally to the people currently speaking, so the scene keeps flowing back to the same 2 or 3 players. Nothing hostile has happened, and no one has explicitly barred the quieter players from participating. But the turn-taking structure of the conversation has still distributed opportunity unevenly. The more socially assertive players receive more spotlight because they enter the conversational queue faster and more often. In effect, they keep getting served first. That's the connection to initiative and turn-taking. Even in a free-form social scene, access to meaningful action is still being organized, just less visibly. The players who can claim the floor most easily often gain temporary authority over the direction of the shared fiction. There is also an important difference between having a seat at the table and having voice that gets uptake. Recent discussion research makes that distinction explicit. Equal presence in a group does not guarantee equal voice or equal uptake of what someone says. In tabletop terms, a player may technically be included in the scene and still receive very little meaningful response. They may speak, but the table keeps moving past them. They may offer ideas, but other players' ideas become the action. They may wait patiently, but the cue never seems to come around cleanly. This is one of the reasons informal spotlight management can feel fine to the players who naturally get served quickly and feel invisible to the players who wait longest. A hidden cue is often easiest to ignore when it is working in your favor. From a game mastering standpoint, that means spotlight management is more than just generosity or social grace. It is part of scene design. When a game master deliberately rotates attention, asks quieter players what they are doing, frames scenes in short passes around the table, or pauses long enough for the less assertive players to enter, they are making the cue more visible and more equitable. Research on discussion and facilitation suggests that structure, timing, and role design can improve participation and interaction, especially when group dynamics would otherwise bunch the conversation around a few people. So when we talk about spotlight, we should think beyond the vague idea of sharing attention. Spotlight is also a weighting system. Some tables manage that system implicitly. Some manage it explicitly. Either way, it has consequences for who gets to matter, how often, and with what degree of response from the fiction. And that is why a scene can look active on the surface and still leave several players feeling like they spent most of it in line. One of the most useful ideas in operations and process analysis is the bottleneck. In plain terms, a bottleneck is the part of a system that most limits its throughput. Quality and process management sources define a constraint or bottleneck as the factor that prevents the system from achieving higher performance or flow. And theory of constraints approaches focus on identifying that limiting point because improving non-bottlenecks usually does much less for the system as a whole. That idea transfers to tabletop RPGs very cleanly. If players are spending a lot of time waiting, the question is simply, why does this session feel slow? But a sharper question might be, what is the limiting step in the flow of meaningful participation? In queuing terms, delays build when work arrives faster than the system can process it, and when utilization gets too high, waiting times can rise very quickly. Little's Law is one of the classic ways of expressing the relationship among throughput, time in system, and the number of items in the system. At the table, that bottleneck might be the game master's attention. It might be a slow rules procedure. It might be one player taking very long turns. It might be a combat with too many active units. Or it could be a scene where nobody is quite sure what actions are available, so every contribution requires clarification before anything can move forward. This is where pacing problems often become more concrete. A combat round may feel sluggish because every turn includes rules lookup, tactical recalculation, and several follow-up clarifications before resolution. A social scene may drag because one NPC interaction is serving as the only gateway through which 5 players are trying to affect the fiction. An investigation may bog down because the game master is acting as a single overloaded server for every question, inference, and clue request. Through this lens, it becomes easier to see why adding more exciting content does not always solve the issue. If the constraint remains untouched, the extra content can actually increase congestion. In process terms, feeding more demand into a constrained system tends to grow the queue. In tabletop terms, adding more enemies, more environmental factors, more decision branches, more NPCs, or more side objectives can deepen the backlog if the table already struggles to process actions smoothly. So let's say the crew is boarding a damaged research station while security drones patrol the halls. That is already enough to create tension. Then the game master adds a reactor leak and a sealed lab door that has to be hacked open before the station locks down. Each element sounds exciting on its own, but the table already struggles with long turns and rules questions. Instead of making the scene feel sharper, the added complications slow everything further because every problem still has to move through the same bottleneck. This also gives us a more useful way to talk about complexity. A game or encounter isn't slow simply because it has many parts. It becomes slow when the active parts create too much load at the point of service. Sometimes a tactically rich game still moves well because players can process decisions in parallel and resolution is crisp. Sometimes a much simpler scene crawls because every meaningful action has to squeeze through one overloaded bottleneck. So when a table feels bogged down, it helps to ask where the flow is actually breaking. What part of the process is doing the most to limit throughput? What part causes everyone else to wait? What step has become the narrow point in the hourglass? That's a more useful diagnostic habit than treating slowness as vague atmosphere. Once you identify the bottleneck, you have a real design problem to solve. At this point, it helps to make an important distinction. Not all waiting at the table is equally bad. One of the most durable ideas in the psychology of waiting is that occupied time feels shorter than unoccupied time. That is extremely useful for tabletop role-playing games because players are often waiting even when they are still engaged. A player may not be taking their own turn in combat, but they may still be watching enemy movement, revising a plan, reacting emotionally to a bad roll, or following the consequences of another character's action. That kind of waiting is still part of active play. It has dramatic content. It has informational value. It keeps the player mentally connected to the fiction. What tends to feel much worse is empty delay. That's the kind of waiting where the player has nothing useful to track, nothing emotionally compelling to hold on to, and no clear sense of when their own contribution will matter again. The clock time may not even be very long, but the experience stretches because the player's attention has detached from the action. So, from a tabletop perspective, there is a real difference between dead waiting and engaged waiting. Dead waiting is the player sitting through a long rules tangle that doesn't affect them. A side conversation that has drifted too far from the table, or a scene in which they have no practical way to enter. Engaged waiting is the player tracking danger, preparing a response, coordinating silently with the group, or watching a consequence unfold that may change their own next move. Waiting research consistently shows that unknown and unexplained waits feel longer than waits that are clear and structured. At the table, that means a player may tolerate a fairly long stretch between actions if the scene is legible and the flow of events still matters to them. A shorter delay can feel worse when the player loses the thread and no longer knows how their turn connects to anything. That gives us a more practical way to think about pacing. The goal isn't to eliminate all delay. Some delay is inevitable in a turn-based, shared imagination game. The goal is to reduce empty delay and increase meaningful delay. In other words, if people are waiting, the wait should contain something to care about. A good combat round often works this way. Even when it's not your turn, the battlefield is changing, an ally's success opens a lane, an enemy's movement closes one, a spell changes the terrain, a bad hit changes priorities. You are waiting, but the wait has shape and consequence. By contrast, a combat round can feel painfully long when every off-turn moment collapses into pure passivity. The same thing applies outside combat. A social scene can hold everyone's attention if each exchange changes the emotional temperature of the room or shifts the stakes for the whole group. It can lose people quickly if only one player is effectively participating and everybody else is waiting for a conversational opening that never really comes. So, one of the clearest lessons here is that the problem isn't waiting in itself. The problem is waiting that has been emptied of involvement. And that's a very useful distinction for game masters and designers because it points toward a practical question. While players are waiting, what is keeping them inside the game? If queuing theory gives game masters a way to diagnose table flow, it also gives game designers a very sharp set of questions. For a game designer, that is meaningful because every role-playing game creates a structure for how players' input gets processed. The game may do that through initiative order, scene procedures, turn phases, conversational norms, action economies, or game master facing adjudication tools. However it is implemented, the design is shaping how long players wait between meaningful opportunities to affect play. That suggests a very useful design question. How often does a player get to make a meaningful decision, and how long do they typically wait between those decisions? A lot of design discussions focus on what options a player has. That's important, of course. But queuing theory pushes us to ask something slightly different as well. How expensive is it in time and attention for the system to process those options? In queuing terms, service discipline and service time matter a great deal because they affect waiting and overall system performance. That means more detail is not automatically a problem, and simplicity is not automatically a solution. A game can support fairly rich decision making and still move smoothly if the service process is clear and efficient. A much lighter game can still bog down if every contribution has to pass through a narrow or ambiguous channel. This is also where bottlenecks become important for design. If one subsystem carries too much load, it can slow everything around it. In role-playing game terms, a bottleneck might be a combat procedure that requires too many nested steps, a character option structure that takes too long to parse at the moment of action, or a game master facing rules framework that centralizes too much authority in one person at one time. Designers can also learn a lot by thinking about queue discipline. In queuing systems, the rule for who gets served next is not incidental. That maps well onto RPG turn structure. A traditional initiative track, a side-based system, a player-chosen order, and a more free-form conversational structure all distribute weighting differently. They create different kinds of predictability, different risks of congestion, and different opportunities for some players to act sooner or more often. Another design lesson is about scaling. Queuing theory is deeply concerned with what happens when demand rises relative to service capacity, because delays can grow quickly as utilization increases. For tabletop games, that suggests a practical design question. How does this game behave when the player count goes up? A procedure that feels brisk with 3 players may feel very different with 5 or 6. A mechanic that creates satisfying depth in a small group may produce long off-turn waiting in a larger group if the system does not distribute processing well. There is also a strong lesson here about off-turn engagement. That means a designer should not only ask, how long are players waiting? A better pair of questions is, what are players doing while they wait? And does the game keep them cognitively or emotionally involved when it is someone else's turn? Some games create passive waiting. Others create active waiting. So from a design standpoint, one of the clearest takeaways is this. Good game flow is not only about option richness or narrative promise, it's also about access. How often can players enter meaningfully? How evenly is attention distributed? How much delay does the structure create? How visible is the queue? How much of the wait still feels like play? That, I think, is what queuing theory offers game designers. It's a useful one because it directs attention to something players feel immediately, even when they don't have vocabulary for it. One potential pitfall of using queuing theory as a lens for tabletop role-playing games is that it can tempt a game master or designer to value efficiency too highly. Waiting matters, and uneven access to play absolutely matters. But tabletop role-playing games are not factory systems or call centers. They are human, social, improvisational experiences. Some pauses are productive. Some long turns are emotionally worth it. A player finally making a difficult decision, a tense silence before a reveal, or a rich in-character exchange can take time and still serve the game beautifully. If a game master becomes too focused on reducing delay at every moment, the session can start to feel overmanaged, rushed, or overly procedural. The table may move faster while losing some of its spontaneity, texture, and emotional breathing room. A related danger is that this framework can make every pacing problem look like a structural one, when some issues are interpersonal, tonal, or contextual. A player may take a long turn because they are anxious, new to the game, or genuinely trying to engage with a complicated situation. A quiet player may not always be silently excluded. Sometimes they are happy observing for a while before stepping in. A chaotic conversation may reflect excitement and creative energy, not dysfunction. So while queuing theory can be a useful diagnostic lens, it should remain one lens among several. It helps us see flow, waiting, and access, but it does not fully capture chemistry, trust, performance style, or the pleasure some groups take in a looser and less optimized form of play. Used well, it sharpens our awareness. Used too rigidly, it can flatten the richness of what tabletop role-playing games actually are. Now let's take a look at a step-by-step game master and design guide. So if we take all of this seriously, what do we actually do with it? Applied to tabletop role-playing games, the question is, how do we reduce bad waiting and increase meaningful participation? First, identify what players are waiting for. Before fixing anything, figure out what the queue actually is. In a formal queuing system, you begin by identifying arrivals, service, and delay. At the table, that means asking, what are players waiting to receive? A turn, a ruling, game master attention, a chance to speak, a consequence, spotlight? This is important because different scenes generate different cues. Combat often creates a visible turn order cue. Social scenes often create a spotlight cue. Investigation scenes often create a game master attention cue. Planning scenes can create a conversational cue where assertive players move quickly and quieter players wait much longer. A good game master habit here is simple observation. In your next session, watch for the points where players mentally go, I want to do something now, and then notice how long it takes before that becomes play. That gap is the cue. From a design standpoint, this step asks, what kinds of waiting does this game create by default? If the answer is a lot of waiting for one central authority to resolve everything, then the structure itself is part of the issue. Next, find the bottleneck. Once you know where the cue is, look for what is limiting flow. Theory of constraints treats the bottleneck as the constraint that most limits system performance, and it argues that improvement should begin there. At the table, common bottlenecks include one player taking very long turns, the game master answering every question and resolving every detail, heavy rules lookup, too many active enemies or NPCs, unclear fictional situations that require constant clarification, scene structures where only one person can interact meaningfully at a time. And this step is important because a lot of tables diagnose slowness too vaguely. Combat drags is true sometimes, but it's not specific enough. The better question is, what exact part of combat is causing everyone else to wait? Is it spell selection, enemy bookkeeping, grid uncertainty, reaction timing, rules ambiguity? For a designer, the parallel question is, what part of the game asks one person or one subsystem to carry too much load? If every meaningful action has to pass through a narrow channel, congestion is almost guaranteed. Next, shorten service time where you can. Queuing performance is affected by the relationship between arrival rate and service rate. If service is slow and arrivals keep coming, the queue grows. In tabletop terms, one obvious way to reduce waiting is to shorten the amount of time it takes to process an action. For game masters, that can mean preloading enemy actions or default choices, grouping similar NPC behavior, keeping frequently used rules close at hand, clarifying stakes before the roll, asking for concise declarations, resolving simple cases quickly when high precision adds little value. For designers, it can mean reducing the number of steps needed to complete a standard action, cutting exception-heavy subsystems, making common procedures easier to remember, building cleaner player aids, designing turns so decision-making and resolution do not sprawl across several disconnected microsteps. By the way, this is not an argument for making everything shallow or stripped down. It's an argument for noticing whether the service time attached to routine actions is proportionate to the value those actions create. Next, make the queue visible. One of the consistent findings in waiting psychology is that uncertain waits feel longer than known waits. That means a table can often improve the experience of delay even before it reduces the delay itself. For game masters, this is a strong practical tool. Tell players who is up and who is next. Show initiative order clearly. In non-combat scenes, announce a table pass. I'm going around the table. Signal when a scene is about to return to a player or subgroup. Make the flow of attention more legible. A visible cue lowers uncertainty. It gives players a sense of orientation. It helps them plan. It also helps quieter players recognize when they will have an opening. For designers, visibility can be built into the game. Explicit turn markers, scene procedures, round structures for social or investigation play, role prompts that guarantee periodic input, player-facing pacing tools that show when contributions are expected. This is especially valuable in games that want free-form conversation without letting free-form turn into hidden inequality. Next, turn waiting into occupied time. The classic point that occupied time feels shorter than unoccupied time is one of the most useful ideas in this entire discussion. At the table, that means you should not only ask how long players wait, ask what they are doing while they wait. For Game Masters, the goal is to keep off-turn players mentally connected. Let consequences evolve in visible ways. Ask what players are noticing, fearing, or preparing. Allow table talk that supports planning without taking over the scene. Keep changing information in play so attention remains useful. Give support actions, reactions, interrupts, or parallel choices where appropriate. For designers, this suggests a powerful question. What does a player do when it is not technically their turn? A game with good off-turn engagement can feel much faster than a game with shorter turns but empty waiting. Next, protect fairness in spotlight distribution. Waiting research also stresses fairness. Unfair waits feel worse than fair ones. In tabletop terms, a queue becomes painful quickly when some players get immediate service and others keep getting deferred. For Game Masters, this means watching for recurring patterns. Who gets answered first? Who gets interrupted? Who has to wait for invitation? Who keeps re-entering the spotlight with no friction? Who quietly disappears from the scene? Then build small interventions. Pause and ask a quiet player what their character is doing. Split scenes intentionally. Cap very long turns gently. Give each player a short pass during tense scenes. Rotate first response privilege in social encounters and investigations. For designers, fairness can be supported with structure. Procedures that prompt every player, scene phases that circulate authority, mechanics for assists, reactions, and follow-ups, role differentiation that gives multiple people valid entry points into the same problem. Next, break one overloaded queue into several smaller flows. A single server queue can become overloaded quickly when too many arrivals pile into the same line. Tabletop play often has this problem when one channel is doing all the work. For Game Masters, one fix is to break a giant queue into smaller flows. Split a large combat into zones or local clusters. Run a negotiation in short exchanges with multiple players contributing. Let investigation tasks happen in parallel. Hand some information tracking to players. Use scene cuts that move briskly among subgroups. This does two things. It reduces overload on one central point of service, and it gives more players active ownership of part of the process. For designers, this can mean distributing authority, shared tracking responsibilities, mechanics that let players answer some questions without waiting on the game master, simultaneous declaration with sequential resolution procedures that let distinct roles operate on partially separate timelines. The principle here is simple. If everything has to go through one narrow point, the queue deepens. If some processing can happen in parallel, the table breathes more easily. Next, audit the system after play. Process improvement depends on feedback. Queuing and constraint-based approaches are useful because they encourage ongoing diagnosis, not one-time fixes. After a session, ask, where did players wait longest? Which waits felt engaged and which felt empty? What created uncertainty? Where did spotlight bunch up? What was the main bottleneck tonight? Did any subsystem create more delay than value? If you're a game master, you can often improve table energy a lot with one small adjustment at the biggest friction point. If you're a designer, this kind of audit helps you separate interesting on paper from smooth in use. Next, design for meaningful access, not just eventual access. A game can say that everyone gets a turn and still leave people waiting too long to matter. A scene can look active and still distribute meaningful participation unevenly. A system can be fair in principle and still produce frustrating delays in practice. So the real design question is not only can players act, it is also how often can they act? How long do they wait? What are they doing while they wait? How clear is the cue? How fair does the distribution of attention feel? Does the system keep players connected to meaningful consequences? That, to me, is where queuing theory becomes genuinely useful for tabletop RPGs. It gives us a way to think about pacing, spotlight, and downtime as structural issues. And once you see them structurally, you can start improving them deliberately. So, what queuing theory gives us is a new lens for thinking about something every tabletop player feels, even if they have never had the words for it. Players experience a game through story, mechanics, tension, character, and emotion. But they also experience it through access. Access to action, to attention, to consequence, to the shared fiction at moments that feel meaningful. This theory gives us language that helps us more accurately describe common table issues. A session can feel slow because players are waiting too long between meaningful contributions. A scene can feel uneven because the spotlight cue is hidden and some people move through it much more easily than others. A combat can feel exhausting because the turn structure produces too much dead time between moments of engagement. In that sense, pacing is not only about speed, it's also about distribution, clarity, and how the flow of participation moves around the table. That's why I think queuing theory is such an interesting lens for tabletop RPGs. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and let me know about your own experiences in the comments section below. Have you played in games where the waiting felt smooth and engaging, or games where the downtime really started to drag? I'd love to hear how you've seen this play out at the table. And as always, thanks for watching. See you next time.